If you went back in time 500 years and asked someone in Europe to play a major scale, they would have no idea what you meant. Literally none. It wasn't a term that anyone had ever used to describe a scale before. It would be like me asking you to play a rhododendron scale. And if you asked them to play a major triad, again, they would be confused. Throughout this video, I'm taking hundreds of years of complex history and simplifying it, sometimes hugely. If you find yourself shouting, "But what about Johannes Lippius's Synopsis Musicae Novae of 1612? Just, breathe into a paper bag. It'll be okay.
Into the bag.
For hundreds of years, music in Europe operated through a system called modality. Modality was supported by the church, and the church basically called the shots. And actually, as far as we know, there were no major competitors, not for centuries. There were, officially, 7 modes: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. It's actually more complicated than this, but this'll do. The names come from our old friend Pythagoras, who named them after regions of ancient Greece. No, Greece. He had been building scales out of perfect fifths. See my video The Perfect Fifth Biography for more on that. And the mathematics pointed to 7 possible distinct scales. They each had a different arrangement of notes and sounded like this. And so for literally hundreds of years, from the so-called Dark Ages — the Dark Ages weren't actually dark, discuss, no — to the Renaissance, this is what European music was made from. For a long time, the notes were arranged into plain song, single-line melodies sung slowly. Eventually, they added a second note, and the roots of modern harmony were planted. But they didn't call it harmony, they called it organum, and the rules eventually formed a whole school of musical thought called counterpoint. And this is where things started falling apart, or coming together. There was a musical revolution forming on the horizon, but while it's easy to see in hindsight, musicians at the time would have no idea the scale — see what I did there? — of the change that was coming. One of the changes involved something called the leading tone. This was the idea that melodies sounded good if they finished with a little melodic note just beneath the main note, which we call the root. So, let's take all our modes and shift the 7th note into a leading tone if it's not already there. As we can see, Mixolydian has now become identical to Ionian. Goodbye, Mixolydian! The next change was basically about racism. By adding a leading tone, we now had some modes with something called an augmented second. This was a common interval in the music of the Middle East, and the Middle East was where the Turks and Moors came from, sort of. And they were, well, winning. The Moors had advanced as far as Tours in France by 732, and the Turks had been surging through southeastern Europe for centuries. They would advance as far as Vienna in Austria, laying siege to it in both 1529 and 1683. So, you wouldn't really want to write music that seemed to say, "Hooray for the Turks and Moors!" So, the augmented seconds needed to go. That was done by raising the 6th degree of the scale. Dorian and Aeolian are now the same. Bye, Dorian! A tiny change that we need to make, but isn't really historical, is about Locrian. Locrian doesn't have a perfect fifth between the 1st and 5th note. Because of this dissonance, it sounds like this. Locrian was never used. But we'll fix Locrian to make it usable, as it's a good illustration of the changes being made to music. Bye, Locrian! The next change is about separating semitones. At the moment, we've got semitones between the root and second of our Phrygian and Locrian scales. But we've also got leading tones, so those scales sound like this. They didn't like that sound of 2 consecutive semitones, so we'll shift the seconds up. Bye, Phrygian! Okay, we need to talk about the tritone some more. The tritone gets a lot of bad press. The usual stories go that it was considered satanic and that people were excommunicated, killed, or worse for using it. As far as I know, there are no early sources calling it satanic, and there is absolutely no proof for anyone being punished in any way for playing or singing a tritone. Those stories all came about much later in the 1700s and after, but it was considered ugly and unstable and best avoided. Well, all that had to change when counterpoint expanded to 3- and 4-note chords. In the 1600s, it was becoming trendy to use more complicated harmony. 3-note chords, called triads, became all the rage. I know, right? And when you add a 3rd note, things change. The 2 basic triads were called major and minor in English, hard and soft in German. Add a 4th note and you could get chords that sounded very musical even when they contained tritones. This chord is called a dominant 7th chord, and it has a tritone here. So, the tritone became important, and where it was located was critical. It had to be between the 4th and 7th note of the scale. So, Lydian has to shift. Bye, Lydian! So, now that we've accommodated all these changes, we find something odd. We've only got 2 scales. And actually, they only have 1 note different between them. That 1 note is the essential thing that gives us our 2 scales, major and minor, because one gives us our hard chord, major, and the other gives us our soft chord, minor. Fortunately for music history, it was decided that the whole leading tone thing only mattered when going up the scale. Down the scale was allowed to not have a leading tone, which meant the 6th also didn't have to be raised. Musicians would soon realize that this change gave minor a lot more possibilities than major, and many great composers, including Bach and Beethoven, wrote some of their best work in minor. In fact, Bach was writing at the time all of this stuff was happening and actually composed a toccata and fugue in Dorian. So, we end up with 3 scales: major, minor going up, called melodic minor, and minor going down, called natural minor. Technically, there is an important 4th scale called the harmonic minor, but as its name implies, it was only used for harmonizing. These changes would become known as tonality and would dominate music for 300 years. In fact, the ideas of tonality are still the foundations for the rules by which we make music today. So, why does this matter? I suppose because it's easy to think that things have always been the way they are. It's easy to assume that we are advancing onward and upward. The reality is that 400 years ago, we changed course, pretty dramatically. And it's only really in the past 100 years, with varied musicians from Bela Bartok to Miles Davis to the Beatles, that we've been delving back into modality, rooting around for musical inspiration. And what I love is that across genres, from jazz to classical to pop, modes are still providing that inspiration.